The station was enormous. I know everyone who writes about it says that, and the word has been stretched so thin by overuse that it barely means anything anymore. But I need you to understand it the way I understood it the first time I arrived on my transfer posting, 3 cycles before the convergence, when I stepped off the transit barge and looked up and felt my knees go genuinely, embarrassingly weak. That was important. I'll come back to that. The Veyrath diplomatic convergence of GY 7441 was the largest multilateral summit Omnivale had hosted in a generation. 23 species, 41 delegations, 312 individual diplomatic representatives, plus support staff, security details, cultural liaisons, medical teams, and the approximately 2,000 journalists, documentary crews, and accredited observers who had descended on the station like insects drawn to a warm light source. I was one of the observers. Junior archivist, Omnivale Cultural Documentation Unit, 18 months into my posting, still young enough to be excited about proximity to history and old enough to know that most history, when you are standing inside it, feels like administrative work. The convergence was supposed to be about the HFY corridor dispute, a stretch of contested deep space between 4 competing territorial claims that had been simmering for 11 years and had recently begun to boil. The details of the dispute are outside the scope of this document. What matters is the context. 23 species, many of whom had complicated histories with one another, packed into a diplomatic station for what was projected to be a 14-day summit. The humans were there. Of course they were there. They were always there at these things now. It had been a shift that happened gradually and then all at once, the way a lot of things involving humans seemed to happen. 30 years ago, humanity had been a peripheral species, newly admitted to Galactic Association membership, regarded with the particular mixture of bemusement and low-grade unease that the association typically reserved for species that were both biologically unusual and politically unpredictable. They were too short-lived. They were too emotionally volatile. Their history of internal violence was extraordinary even by the standards of a galaxy that had seen its share. And yet they were also, and this was the part that made everyone nervous, relentlessly, almost recklessly effective. By GY 7441, humans held 3 seats on the Galactic Association Security Council. They commanded the largest standing rapid response fleet in the association's history. And they had, in 2 separate crises over the preceding decade, intervened militarily in situations where every other member species had chosen caution, and won. Nobody quite knew what to do with them. The human diplomatic delegation to the Veyrath convergence was led by Ambassador Calaverne, a woman in her middle 50s by human reckoning, with a reputation for patience and a documented record of sitting across negotiating tables from species that wanted her dead and refusing to be anything other than politely, devastatingly reasonable. Her support staff numbered 14. Her security detail numbered 6. The 6 were what I want to talk about. Section 2, the guard detail, and why everyone noticed them. The humans called them the Sentry Unit, though within the delegation they apparently used a range of informal names that I was only told about later, in the interviews. The unit was composed of 6 individuals, all of them combat veterans by their service records, all of them trained in the specific protocols of close protection work in multi-species diplomatic environments, a specialty that had existed for less than 20 years in the human military and had already developed a reputation as one of the more demanding postings a human soldier could draw. They rotated in pairs through an 8-tower cycle, 2 on the floor outside the human delegation's suite at all times. One positioned at the entrance to whatever meeting room Ambassador Verne was currently occupying. One at the public-facing intersection between the human corridor and the main concourse, what the station staff called the threshold point, which had a long history as the place where diplomatic incidents began, because it was where the controlled environment of a delegation's private corridor met the unpredictable chaos of Omnivale's general population. I am going to tell you about the one stationed at the threshold point. His name was Specialist Davin Holt, 29 years old by human reckoning. From a place in the American continent's interior called Nebraska, which I subsequently learned was notable for its flat landscape, its agricultural production, and its tendency to produce humans who were, in the words of one of his colleagues, genuinely unflappable in a way that people from more dramatic geographies sometimes found unsettling. He was not the tallest member of the unit. He was not the most decorated. That was Warrant Officer Sarah Zockaffer, who had 2 commendations and a field promotion on her record. He was not the one with the most striking appearance. That distinction arguably went to Specialist Yuan Fang, who was extraordinarily tall by human standards and had a habit of standing very still that made him look, to several of the non-human species present, like a predator in the moment before it moved. Davin Holt was, by every external measure, the least remarkable member of the unit. Which is why what happened on day 4 of the convergence was so unexpected, and why, 3 years later, I am still writing about it. Section 3. The convergence opens and the station fills. The first 3 days of the convergence were what I would describe as professionally uneventful and personally overwhelming. 23 delegations arrived in a window of approximately 36 hours. Each arrival had its own protocol. The Dravac, for instance, required that the docking bay's atmospheric processors be run at a specific filtration level before their transport doors opened. Or their chief diplomat, Elder Vothkreen, would experience respiratory distress. The Sulthrani delegation arrived in a sealed environmental transport and refused to exit it for the first 12 hours, which was apparently standard procedure and not, as 2 junior diplomatic aides initially feared, some kind of hostage situation. The human delegation arrived on day 1, mid-cycle, on a mid-sized transport that bore the registration of the Association Diplomatic Fleet, but had human military engine signatures that the station's traffic systems flagged, and then immediately deflagged when the clearance codes came through. Ambassador Verne walked off the gangway without fanfare, shook hands with the station's diplomatic liaison chief, and was halfway to the human suite before the welcoming committee had finished arranging itself. The sentry unit was already deployed before she reached her rooms. I saw Specialist Holt for the first time that afternoon when I was walking the main concourse doing what archivists do, which is to say, I was trying to observe everything at once and writing notes that would later embarrass me with their naivety. He was standing at the threshold point, in the intersection where the main concourse's central pedestrian lane crossed the entrance to the human delegation's corridor, and my first impression of him was so mundane that I almost didn't note it at all. He was standing. That was it, he was standing. Not pacing, not scanning the room with theatrical vigilance, not doing any of the things you might expect of someone whose job was security. He was simply standing in a spot, in the particular way that someone stands when they have decided that this spot is where they will be, and no subsequent development is likely to change that decision. He wore the human diplomatic security uniform, dark gray, clean lines, the rank insignia on the shoulder that I later learned was the specialist's tab, and he had his hands clasped loosely in front of him, and his posture was straight without being rigid, and his face was. His face was doing something that I noticed and then moved on from, because at the time I did not understand what I was seeing. He was looking down, not at the floor, not at his boots. His gaze was angled slightly downward from horizontal, directed at nothing in particular at the middle distance, or at something inside the middle distance, something the rest of us could not see. And his expression was, I wrote the word still in my notes and then crossed it out because still was not quite right. Still implies absence, the way a room is still when no one is in it. This was different. There was something happening behind his eyes. Something was moving. I just could not see what it was. I moved on. I had 36 other things to observe. But I noted it, and later I would be grateful that I had. Section 4, days 1 through 3. The machinery of diplomacy. I want to give you a sense of the station in those first 3 days, because context matters, and because the convergence was not, for most of its participants, a story about one human guard at a corridor intersection. It was a story about 23 civilizations trying to find a way to talk to each other about a stretch of contested space without the conversation collapsing into something worse. The plenary sessions were held in the Convergence Hall, which was on the main spine, 4 levels above the ring that contained the delegation suites. It seated 400 and had a translation system that operated in real time across 63 languages and dialects, with a noted lag of approximately 1.3 seconds for highly idiomatic or emotionally complex phrasing. The lag had caused problems in previous summits. The Dravac in particular found extended pauses to be conversationally significant in ways that overlapped badly with the translation system's timing. I attended 4 of the first 6 plenary sessions in my capacity as a documentation observer. I will spare you the details of the substantive negotiations, not because they were unimportant, but because they are well documented elsewhere, and because this account is specifically concerned with events that occurred outside the Convergence Hall. What I will tell you is the atmosphere of those sessions. The tension, not the dramatic, sudden tension of a crisis, but the slow, grinding tension of intelligent beings who disagree about something important and know that how they handle the disagreement will determine whether their grandchildren live in a stable galaxy. The careful language, the deliberate pauses, the moments where a delegate from one species said something that was technically correct in translation, but carried a subtext that landed entirely differently on 12 distinct sets of ears, and the subsequent 10 minutes of procedural maneuvering to address the resulting confusion. The human delegation was, throughout all of this, very quiet. Ambassador Verne spoke 4 times in the first 3 days. Each statement was precise, brief, and strategically positioned. She waited until the room had established where the fault lines were, and then she said exactly the thing that applied gentle pressure to the most productive of those fault lines without appearing to take sides. It was skilled diplomacy. Even the delegates who didn't like her, and there were some, for reasons that I'll address, admitted, in the interviews I conducted later, that she was skilled. The sentry unit rotated through their positions with the regularity of station life support systems. I walked past the threshold 8 or 9 times a day on various errands, and there was always a human there. Sometimes it was Akaffer, tall, deliberate, with the particular quality of attention that made you feel she had already assessed you and filed you under a heading before you'd finished approaching. Sometimes it was Fang, whose stillness I mentioned. Sometimes it was Holt. It was always Holt when something interesting happened, which I subsequently decided was either a statistical coincidence or the universe's sense of dramatic structure. Section 5, the Solthrani Incident, Day 2, and why it matters. On Day 2, there was what the official incident log classified as a minor diplomatic friction event in the corridor outside the Convergence Hall. A junior member of the Solthrani delegation, whose name, by their custom, I will not reproduce here without authorization, made a comment to a Dravac cultural attaché that was technically accurate in the shared diplomatic language, but carried a biological insult that the translation system had not caught because the insult was embedded in the rhythm of the sentence rather than its content. The Dravac attaché escalated immediately, as Dravac do. Their escalation style is vocal. They produce a specific subsonic frequency when affronted that is below the threshold of most species' hearing, but registers as a physical sensation, a kind of pressure behind the sternum. The corridor filled with that pressure, and everyone in it stopped walking and looked around for the source. The Solthrani representative was confused. The Dravac attaché was vibrating. Station security had 2 officers in the corridor, and they moved immediately to position themselves between the parties, which was the correct protocol, but was complicated by the fact that Station Security Unit 7 at that point consisted of a Verath officer and a Keth officer, and Keth have a physiological stress response that causes their chromatophores to activate. They shift color rapidly when alarmed, which, in this specific context, caused the Solthrani representative to interpret the Keth officer's presence as a threat display rather than a peacekeeping one. What I am describing is the way that interspecies situations can cascade. No one in that corridor meant harm. No one was acting in bad faith. 3 different biological and cultural response systems collided in a tight space and produced a situation that was, for about 90 seconds, genuinely concerning. What ended it was Specialist Holt. He wasn't assigned to that corridor. He was at the threshold point, which was around a curve in the concourse, out of direct sight of the incident. But he had apparently heard, or registered, through whatever mechanism, the subsonic disturbance, because when I reviewed the corridor footage later, he appeared at the corridor entrance 12 seconds after the Dravac attaché's initial escalation, moving at a pace that was brisk but not running, covering ground with an efficiency that read as completely unhurried even though he was moving fast. He did not draw anything. He did not issue commands. He walked into the corridor, placed himself at a specific geometric point, equidistant from both parties. I measured it later on the footage and simply existed there in that way he had, looking slightly down, hands loosely at his sides, present. The Keth officer's chromatophores stabilized within 4 seconds of Holt's arrival. I have reviewed this footage multiple times, and I still cannot fully explain why. The Keth officer later said, in his after-action report, that he had interpreted Holt's arrival as the arrival of a stillness, which I understood not as a tactical observation, but as a biological one. Something in the human's affect had registered on the Keth officer's nervous system as calm, and the Keth nervous system, which is keyed to mirror environmental emotional states in high-stress situations, had responded. The Sulthrani representative had stopped vibrating. They have a stress response too, a rippling in the outer gill membranes, the moment Holt arrived in the corridor. I don't know what they registered. I interviewed the representative 8 days later and asked. They said, after a long pause, he looked as though he was not afraid of us. The Dravac attaché's subsonic output dropped within 30 seconds. The two station security officers exchanged a look that I captured on my observer's camera. It was a look that contained, in my reading of it, a very specific mixture of relief and bewilderment. The corridor cleared. Holt waited until it was clear, then turned and walked back to the threshold point. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't appear to report the incident. His unit had a secure communications channel, but the channel logs I was later authorized to review showed no transmission from him during that window. He just went back to standing, looking down, present. I wrote 6 pages in my journal that night and then deleted all of them, because I didn't know what I was trying to say. Day 4 began with a tension that had accumulated from the previous 3 days like water behind a dam that was not quite strong enough. The plenary session had stalled on the question of navigational access rights through the secondary HFY lanes, and the stall had a quality that the experienced diplomatic observers recognized as different from ordinary procedural delay. This was the kind of stall that happens when a negotiation has located the real disagreement underneath all the preliminary ones, when all the surface-level friction has been worked through, and what remains is the thing that nobody has said out loud yet, because saying it out loud means they have to decide what to do about it. 3 of the delegations had requested extended recesses. 2 had asked for private bilateral sessions that were not yet scheduled. The Dravac Elder Vothkreen had made a statement at the end of Day 3's evening session that was technically a procedural observation, but carried, in the Dravac cultural encoding that their allies in the room understood, the weight of a warning. Breakfast in the Convergence Hall's common dining area was quieter than it had been on Day 1. The groups were tighter. The smaller conversations were louder than the room's ambient noise, not because people were speaking loudly, but because the larger table conversations had mostly stopped. You could feel it. Even if you were a junior archivist who had never attended a summit before, you could feel that something was different about this morning. I arrived early, as I usually did, because I found it useful to observe the room before it filled. I had coffee, a human beverage that had become something of an obsession of mine during my posting, and that I was mildly embarrassed about, and I sat at a small table near the wall and watched the delegations arrive. The human delegation came in together, which they usually did. Ambassador Vern first, reading something on a slim display tablet, then 2 of her senior advisors, then 3 of the junior staff. The sentry unit maintained their positions. I could see through the common area's entrance that there was a guard at the corridor junction, which today was Holt. What was different this morning was who was in the common area besides the human delegation. Section 7, Ambassador Sirving Kothmoral and the matter of reputation. I should tell you about Sirving Kothmoral because she is central to everything that happened next, and I want you to understand her before I describe what she did. She was the 3rd ambassador of the Veyrath Concordance, which is the formal title for what functioned as the Veyrath's senior diplomatic representative to negotiations of this class. The Veyrath, if you are unfamiliar with them, and many species outside the core systems are one of the older galactic civilizations, by which I mean they have been spacefaring for approximately 11,000 years, and have the institutional memory and the subtle embedded arrogance that tends to accumulate in species that have been around that long. They are not unkind. They are not cruel. But they carry the particular confidence of a civilization that has watched other civilizations rise and fall, and considers itself to have learned the important lessons from the process. Kothmoral was 74 years old by Veyrath reckoning, which placed her in the late middle period of her species' lifespan, roughly equivalent, in terms of experience and physical capacity, to a human in their late 40s. She had served as a diplomatic representative for 31 years. She had attended 11 major convergence summits. She had, in those 31 years, developed a reputation for being exceptionally perceptive about non-Verath species, for reading them with a depth that her colleagues found remarkable, and that her subjects, when they found out about it, sometimes found unsettling. She was also, it should be noted, someone who had written publicly about humans. She had published 2 academic papers in the Association's Interspecies Studies Journal on the subject of human behavioral patterns in diplomatic contexts. The papers were considered authoritative. I had read them both in preparation for this posting. The first paper argued that humans had a uniquely high tolerance for social ambiguity. They could inhabit uncertain situations without the neurological distress that most species experienced, which made them effective in negotiating environments, but occasionally difficult to read for species that relied on consistent emotional signaling. The second paper examined human military bearing in diplomatic settings and argued that the discipline humans maintained was a form of social communication, that their stillness and control were not neutral states, but were themselves signals directed at whoever was watching. She had been correct about that second point in ways I don't think she had fully anticipated. On the morning of Day 4, Ambassador Kothmoral arrived in the common dining area earlier than her delegation, which was itself unusual. She was alone except for her personal assistant, a young Verath named Thessel, no relation to me, despite the similarity in the name's root, who was carrying a documentation tablet and looking slightly overwhelmed, as young Verath assistants at their first major convergence generally did. She did not join any of the other delegations. She got a beverage. The Verath equivalent is a warm infusion of something called vessel root, which smells pleasant but which humans apparently find unpleasant, and vice versa, and she chose a table at the edge of the room that had a clear sightline to the entrance. She was watching the corridor junction. She was watching Holt. Section 8, the moment she saw him looking down. I want to be precise about this, because precision matters, and because the moment that the official record tends to summarize in 2 sentences was, in the living experience of it, something more layered than a summary can hold. Holt had been at his post for approximately 90 minutes when Kothmoral arrived in the dining area. He had been in the standard posture, that posture, the one that had caught my attention on Day 1 for the duration. Standing, hands clasped, gaze directed slightly downward and inward. He was not unaware of his surroundings. That was the thing I had come to understand over 3 days of intermittent observation. His gaze was angled down, but his peripheral engagement was extraordinary. I had seen him register a sudden movement 20 meters to his left without visibly moving his eyes, had seen him shift his weight fractionally in response to a sound that I hadn't heard before I heard it. The downward gaze was not inattention. It was something else. Kothmoral watched him for 7 minutes before she moved. I know it was 7 minutes because I was watching her, and I was running my archival log, and when I reviewed the timestamp later, I counted the seconds. She watched him the way she watched everything, with the considered attention of someone who was simultaneously observing and cataloging, who was taking what she saw and running it against a deep interior library of everything she had previously seen and looking for the match. I could see it happening in her face, in the particular way she held her beverage without drinking it. Then she set the beverage down. She said something to Thessel, who nodded and remained at the table, and she walked to the entrance of the common area where the corridor junction was visible, and she stopped at the boundary. She looked at Holt. He was still looking down. She studied that for a moment, then she said something. I was not close enough to hear it. I moved. I am an archivist. Moving toward the source of an interesting event is the core professional reflex, and 3 days at this summit had tuned that reflex to a fine point. I crossed the common area in a way that I hoped looked purposeful rather than nosy, arrived at a position near the entrance, and heard the tail end of what she was saying. Unusual, she was saying in the shared diplomatic language, and her tone was the tone of someone who has decided to risk being curious out loud. For a security position, the standard close protection bearing is outward-facing, eyes forward, threat vector prioritization. What you are doing is not that. Holt turned his head. Not sharply, not with the speed of someone who had been caught off guard. With the slow, deliberate movement of someone who had known she was there, and was now choosing to acknowledge it. The way you turn when someone has been standing at the edge of your awareness, and you decide it is time to bring them fully into it. He looked at her. He had gray-green eyes, I noticed, which was an irrelevant detail except that in the moment it was the detail I registered most clearly, perhaps because the eyes were so alert and so specific in a face that had been, until this moment, largely turned away. "Ambassador," he said. Not yes, not can I help you, just the title, an acknowledgement he knew who she was. "You know me," she said, and it was not quite a question. "Memorized all 38 primary delegates on day one," he said. "Photographs and physiological profiles. Ambassador Kothmoral, Verath Concordance, third of that name to hold this specific diplomatic posting. You've attended 11 convergence summits. You speak 6 diplomatic languages, and you read body language better than anyone except possibly Elder Voth Kreen, and you tend to arrive early when something is bothering you." She was quiet for a moment. "That last detail is not in my official profile," she said. "No," he agreed. "I noticed it yesterday and today." Section 9, the curious question. She looked at him for a while. I don't know how long it felt long, but probably it was 30 seconds, which feels long when you are watching it in silence. Then she said, "Why are you looking down?" It was that simple. 4 words in the diplomatic language with the particular Verath intonation that carries, and I say this as someone who had spent 18 months learning to read Verath speech, the quality of a genuine inquiry. Not rhetorical, not a challenge. The intonation that means, I have observed something I do not understand, and I want to understand it. The common dining area had achieved a particular quality of quiet. I do not think most people had deliberately chosen to listen. I think the silence happened the way silences sometimes do in a room, organically, because enough individuals simultaneously had the instinct that something worth listening to was happening. Holt was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I'm counting." Section 10, what he said next. Kothmoral did not react with surprise. She reacted with the focused attention of someone who has just received new information and is integrating it rapidly. "Counting what?" she asked. And this is where I want you to pay attention, because what he said next, the way he explained it, was not the answer anyone expected. I have interviewed 31 witnesses who were present in or adjacent to the dining area during this exchange, and 30 of them reported that they had expected some variant of a tactical answer. A threat counting system, a method for tracking personnel movement. Something military, something procedural, something that would fit the established profile of what a human guard in a security position was supposed to be doing. What they got was none of those things. "I'm counting good things," Holt said. Kothmoral blinked. That is a Verath gesture that is not quite equivalent to a human blink. It involves both the primary and secondary lids and carries the meaning of recalibration in progress. "I'm sorry," she said. "Could you?" "Every time something goes right," he said, "I add it. Walking past each other without incident, a conversation that doesn't break down, a meal that everybody at the table gets through without a diplomatic incident. Small things, I count them." He paused. He looked at her with the directness of someone who had decided to say the true thing, and was doing so without either apology or performance. "We're 4 days into a convergence with 23 species that have a combined history of, conservatively, 9,000 years of not always getting along. And so far today, 37 different pairs of individuals from different delegations have passed through this intersection without incident. That's 37 separate moments where it could have gone wrong and it didn't. I keep track of them." He paused again. "When you count the things that go right, you get a different picture of what's actually happening than when you're only watching for what can go wrong." The silence had gone very deep now. I had stopped pretending to have a purpose for being near the entrance. I was standing in the open, my archival log running, my stylus in my hand but not moving, because writing felt like it would disturb the specific quality of this moment. Kothmoral looked at him for a long time. "You are afraid," she said slowly, "aren't you?" It was not an accusation. It was a reading, the reading of someone who had spent 31 years learning to see past surfaces. "Yes," Holt said, simply, without hesitation. "Of what?" "Of it going wrong," he said. "Of the one incident that cascades, of being at this post and missing the thing that I should have caught." of 23 civilizations coming to this station to try to talk to each other, and one moment of failure sending them home angrier than they arrived. He looked at her steadily. So I count the ones that don't fail, to remind myself that most of them don't. She walked back to her table and sat down. Thessel said something to her. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at her vessel root infusion, which had gone cold, and then at the entrance of the common area where Holt had returned to his position, looking down again, counting again. Then she said something to Thessel that I couldn't hear, and Thessel made a note on the documentation tablet, and Kothmoral picked up her cold infusion and finally drank some of it. I sat down 2 tables away and wrote in my archival log for 20 minutes. I wrote fast and badly, the way you write when you're trying to capture something before it dissolves, and I kept crossing out words because the words were inadequate. At the end of 20 minutes, I had something that was less than what I'd been trying to say, but more than nothing, and I stopped because my hand was beginning to ache. What I had written was, roughly, he is doing the thing that everyone in this room is doing wrong. They are counting the risks. He is counting the moments that the risk does not materialize. These are not the same number. The first one makes you smaller as the day goes on. The second one, I think the second one makes you something else. The morning plenary session began 2 hours later. Section 12, the session that almost broke. I need to tell you about the session, because it connects to what happened afterward. The morning plenary on day 4 was the one that the diplomatic histories will record as the most dangerous moment of the Verath convergence. The reason is this. The Dravak elder Vothkreen presented a formal territorial claim to a portion of the HFY corridor that overlapped with an existing, though disputed, claim by the Sulthrani collective, and in presenting it, used a phrase in the shared diplomatic language that the Sulthrani delegation's chief translator interpreted as a deliberate historical slight. Whether it was deliberate is still argued. I've read the transcripts in 4 different language contexts, and my honest assessment is that Vothkreen chose an ambiguous construction that could be read either way, which is a form of diplomatic communication that every species over a certain age uses when they want to apply pressure without committing to a position. The Sulthrani translator chose the most aggressive reading. He was not wrong to do so, given the history. But the choice meant that what Vothkreen said and what the Sulthrani delegation heard were 2 different things, and the difference was significant. The Sulthrani chief delegate, Ambassador Kretheles Vone, a being of considerable composure and a distinguished 40-year diplomatic career, stood up. In Sulthrani diplomatic culture, standing when the floor belongs to another delegate is an act of extreme formal protest. It is 1 step below walking out. The Convergence Hall's translation system was sophisticated enough to carry the cultural weight of the gesture across to all 22 other delegations. I watched it land in the room the way a stone lands in water, the initial impact, and then the spreading rings. Vothkreen stopped speaking. The room held its breath. Ambassador Verne, seated at the human delegation's position near the center of the curved table, put down her stylus. She waited 4 seconds. In the human cultural framework, 4 seconds of silence before speaking is not unusual. In many of the other cultural frameworks present, 4 seconds was exactly long enough for the silence to acquire the quality of considered wait rather than uncertain hesitation. Then she said, "Elder Vothkreen, Ambassador Vone, with the permission of the chair, I'd like to ask a question." The chair, a neutral species moderator from the Galactic Association's permanent diplomatic staff, gave permission. Verne said, "We are on day 4 of a 14-day convergence. Between day 1 and this moment, we have had, let me count, because I think it's worth counting, 4 plenary sessions, 11 bilateral consultations, 37 hours of direct negotiation, and approximately 11,000 individual interactions between delegates from 23 different civilizations. We have resolved 7 preliminary agenda items. We have found common ground on the navigational rights framework in 3 of the 4 contested sectors." She looked around the room, not confrontationally, looking the way someone looks when they want a room to see itself. "1 phrase in 1 statement," she said, "is going to determine whether the other 11,000 interactions count for something. I think it's worth asking, which number do we want to be focused on right now?" Section 13, the room after Verne spoke. The silence lasted for what I later measured as 11 seconds. Elder Vothkreen sat very still, With Dravac, stillness is paradoxically a sign of active internal processing. The subsonic vibration that indicates agitation had stopped. Voth Kreen was thinking. Ambassador Vone remained standing for 3 more seconds. Then she sat down. The convergence hall's ambient sound, the soft background of climate systems and translation processors, suddenly seemed louder, because the human sound of 41 delegations holding their collective breath had released. The chair called a procedural recess of 30 minutes. I walked out of the convergence hall behind 3 other observers and a cluster of junior diplomatic staff, and we all sort of looked at each other in the corridor and didn't say anything for a moment, because the moment required silence before it could be spoken about. Then one of the other observers, a Keth journalist named Thavris, whom I had gotten to know in the first 3 days, said, in a very quiet voice, "She did that on purpose." "Which part?" I asked. "The counting," Thavris said. "The let me count because I think it's worth counting." She framed it that way on purpose. I want to know why. I thought about Holt at the threshold point, looking down at his own invisible count. "I think," I said slowly, "I might know." Section 14, the conversation that spread. I don't want to claim that what happened next was solely attributable to Kothmorl's conversation with Holt that morning. History doesn't work that way, and I am an archivist, and archivists are supposed to be precise about causation. But I do want to tell you what I observed in the 30-minute recess and in the hours that followed, because the sequence matters. During the recess, Kothmorl spoke to her counterpart from the Dravac technical staff, a mid-level diplomat named Rothesson, who had been present in the plenary hall and who wore the particular expression of someone whose elder had just created a problem they were going to have to manage. The conversation lasted 8 minutes. I could not hear it, but I watched Kothmorl's posture and the way Rothesson's secondary gill membranes, which signal emotional state in Dravac, shifted from the tight, contracted position of stress toward something more open. After the recess ended, Rothesson had a brief exchange with Elder Voth Kreen. In the afternoon plenary, Voth Kreen made a clarifying statement that addressed the ambiguity in the morning's phrasing. The statement was technically a procedural clarification. It did not constitute a concession or an apology in any formal sense. But the cultural encoding was unambiguous to everyone in the room. It was a step back from the edge. Ambassador Vone received it. She did not respond immediately. The Sulthrani protocol was to receive and consider. She responded in the following morning session. Her response was a reciprocal procedural clarification that served the same function in the reverse direction. The convergence did not break, it continued. I do not want to give the impression that Holt's conversation with Kothmorl saved the summit. The summit was navigated by professionals, by Verne and Voth Kreen and Vone, and 38 other diplomats who had spent decades learning to do exactly what they did. What I want to say is something more modest, and I think more interesting. The conversation changed something, not the summit, something smaller and more essential. It changed the frame, the internal orientation of at least some of the people who were inside those rooms, who were carrying those conversations, who were making those calculations. Counting what goes right. It sounds simple. It sounds almost embarrassingly simple, the kind of thing that would fit on a motivational display screen without any effort. But simple things, when they are genuinely true, have a specific quality that distinguishes them from merely plausible things. They resist reduction. The more you look at them, the more they seem to contain. Section 15. What I saw at the threshold point that evening. The evening of day 4. The diplomatic events for the day had concluded. The station's ambient lighting had shifted to its evening spectrum, slightly warmer, slightly dimmer, the change so subtle it was more felt than seen. I was heading back to the archival office along the main concourse when I passed the threshold point. Holt was still at his post, or he was there again. I wasn't certain whether this was a continuous shift or whether he had rotated out and back. He was standing the same way, looking down. But there was someone else at the intersection. Kothmorl. She was standing a few feet from him at the boundary of the corridor junction, and she was looking down too. Not at the floor, at the same non-specific middle distance that he was looking at. And her posture was subtly different from her usual posture, which was upright and composed and carried the authority of her position like a garment. This posture was not relaxed exactly, more like settled. like the difference between a body that is holding itself in readiness and a body that has given itself permission to simply be where it is. I stopped walking. They were not speaking. They were just standing there, two individuals from two very different civilizations, at the same intersection, looking in roughly the same direction at roughly the same invisible thing. After about a minute, Holt said something. I was too far away to hear it. Kothmoral made a sound, not a word, a sound, the kind that means yes or I see or simply I'm listening. Holt said something else. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that was longer, and Holt nodded. I kept walking. Some conversations are not for observers. But I noted it, and I thought about the Dravac corridor 3 days earlier, and I thought about the plenary session that morning. And I thought about a word, a human word, one that I had encountered in my reading and had written down because it seemed important, but that I hadn't quite understood until now. Vigil. To keep vigil, to remain present, to watch over something, not because you are waiting for catastrophe, but because you believe that what you are watching over has value. That the act of attending, of being there, of counting, of not looking away, is itself a form of care. That was what he was doing at that intersection, every shift, every hour, looking down at his count, looking up at the room, attending. On day 6, Kothmoral's assistant Thessel came to the archival office with a request. He wanted to know if I had documentation on human military bearing protocols. Specifically, whether there was any formal written guidance on the posture and positioning that diplomatic security personnel were expected to maintain. I told him I had some general materials, but that the specific protocols would be internal to the human military and might not be available in open-source archival form. He said, Ambassador Kothmoral thinks there might not be a protocol for it. She thinks he invented it himself. I looked at him. The looking down thing, he clarified. She asked the human delegation's cultural liaison, and the liaison said it wasn't a formal technique. It was something specialist Holt developed during his previous posting. The liaison seemed uncertain about whether to call it a quirk or a method. What does Kothmoral call it? I asked. Thessel thought about it. She's still deciding, he said. She's been using the word meditation, but she doesn't think that's quite right. She said it's more like practicing gratitude through arithmetic. She said it's the most purely military thing she's ever seen. Military. She said that the discipline required to count what goes right, in an environment where everything is calibrated to detect threat, is the most demanding form of self-regulation she's encountered. It runs against every trained instinct. She said that she has studied humans for 31 years, and this is the first time she's encountered something that she genuinely has no framework for. I wrote that down, all of it. Section 17, the inquiry that grew. By day 8, the conversation had spread in the way that things spread in a closed environment like a diplomatic station, not through formal channels, but through the capillary action of individuals talking to other individuals who talk to other individuals. And the thing that each of them passed along was not a piece of information, but a question. Why is the human guard looking down? I heard it in the dining area. I heard it in the observation corridors. I overheard it in 3 different languages, between 2 different pairs of people who had no connection to each other, and no apparent way of knowing that the other pair was also asking. 2 delegates, one from the Fenrath Collective, one from the Keth Interstellar Compact, independently asked the human delegation's cultural liaison the same question on the same day. The liaison told me about it afterward, visibly pleased and slightly bewildered. They both asked why he looks down, the liaison said, and when I told them they both just stopped, and then they asked me to say it again. What did you tell them? The truth, the liaison said, that he counts good moments. That it's something he started doing on his first deployment when he was 19 years old because he found that the job made him hyper-focused on what could go wrong and it was making him, he used the word hollowed out, like a thing that had been emptied of everything except fear. And he decided that wasn't who he wanted to be, so he started counting. I sat with that for a while. 19 years old, a human soldier, barely what their species would consider an adult, finding in himself the discipline to resist the frame that the job was trying to impose on him, choosing, consciously, to carry a different count. Section 18, the night the corridor was full. On day 10, Something happened that was not planned and was not on the official summit schedule, and that I am quite certain no one in the station's administrative hierarchy was aware of until after the fact. At approximately 2200 station time, which was deep into the evening cycle with the corridors dim and the main concourse largely empty, someone stopped at the threshold point. Not Koth Moral, a Fenrath delegate, one of the junior ones, a young being named Resvolothen, who was on the Convergence team and who, based on subsequent conversations, had been having a very hard several days for reasons related to the internal politics of the Fenrath delegation. Volothen stopped at the intersection and looked at Holt. "You're the one who counts things?" Volothen said, in the diplomatic language, which was careful because the Fenrath sometimes found the language awkward. "I was told about it." Holt looked at the young delegate. "I try," he said. "How does it work?" Volothen asked. "Do you have to be trained for it? Is there a method?" And Holt, who was on duty, who was at his post, who had a security responsibility that was not suspended because a junior delegate from the Fenrath Collective wanted to talk about counting methods, considered this. He considered it for a few seconds with the gravity he gave to most things, and then he said, "You need a baseline, something small that you know goes right more often than it goes wrong, and then you count it every time it happens. You catch yourself when it goes wrong and you note it, but you count the times it goes right. You keep both numbers. At the end of the day, you look at the ratio." Volothen was very still. "And what is your ratio?" Volothen asked. "Here in this summit." Holt was quiet for a moment. "Good to bad," he said. "Roughly 37-1 over 10 days. Volothen stared at him. "In a summit with 23 species and 11,000 years of combined political history," Volothen said, "you're counting 37 good moments for every bad one." "Yes," Holt said. "How?" Volothen asked, and the how was not a tactical question. It was the how of someone who has been looking at the same situation and seeing something very different. "The moments are small," Holt said. "Most of the good ones are very small. You have to decide to count them. They don't announce themselves." Volothen stood there for a long time. Then Volothen said, "Can I stand here for a while?" Holt said, "It's a common area. You can stand wherever you want." Volothen stood at the intersection for 40 minutes. I know because I was watching from the observation corridor above one of my documentation routes, and I watched the 40 minutes happen. Holt did not speak during most of it. He went back to his position, his posture, his downward gaze, his counting. Volothen stood a few feet away and did what looked from above like the same thing. Before leaving, Volothen said something to Holt that I couldn't hear. Holt responded. Volothen walked back toward the Fenrath delegation's corridor. The next morning in the plenary session, Volothen's delegation proposed a modification to the navigational rights framework that broke a 2-day deadlock. It was a small modification, a careful one, but it worked. Section 19, what Ambassador Verne knew. I want to be honest about something. When I finally had an interview with Ambassador Verne, on day 12, a brief one, 30 minutes in a side room off the main concourse, I asked her whether she had planned any of it. She looked at me with the expression of someone who has been asked a reasonable question and is deciding how to answer it. "Davin has been doing the counting thing for 6 years, she said, since his first posting. He's been on my detail for 2 years. In 2 years, I have not once seen him get what I'd call rattled, and I've seen situations that would rattle most people. He told me he's afraid," I said. "He is afraid," she said. "He'll tell you that. He doesn't hide it. But he made a decision a long time ago about which direction to look when he's afraid. He looks at the evidence that the thing he's protecting still exists." I wrote that down. "Did you know Koth Moral would ask him?" I asked. "I thought she might," Verne said. "She's observant. She'd been watching him for 3 days. I noticed." She paused. "I didn't arrange it, if that's what you're asking. But you knew what he'd say." She smiled, and the smile was the particular one. I'd seen it twice before, in the plenary hall, that was both warm and precise. The smile of someone who knows something and is deciding exactly how much of it to share. "I knew he'd tell the truth," she said. "Davin always tells the truth. The counting is just his way of making sure the truth he's telling himself is the full one." The Verath diplomatic convergence of GY 7441 concluded on day 14 with the signing of the Omnivale Accord, a navigational rights framework that addressed the HFY corridor dispute and established a joint administration mechanism for the contested secondary lanes. 21 of the 23 delegations signed. The remaining 2 initialed a separate protocol of intent, which was legally distinct but diplomatically equivalent for the immediate purpose. The official summaries describe the accord as a significant achievement in multilateral diplomacy. They are correct. It was. I was at the signing ceremony. It was formal and long and beautiful in the specific way that formal and long things are beautiful when you know how much they cost, not in money, but in the accumulated weight of what it took to get everyone into the same room, saying the same words, willing to commit. Holt was at his post during the ceremony, at the threshold point, which was on the route that every delegate walked on the way to the signing chamber. He stood there for 4 hours while the ceremony unfolded in a room he couldn't see, in a process he wasn't part of, and he counted. I walked past him twice. The second time I stopped. "What's your ratio today?" I asked. I don't know why I asked it. It felt right. He looked at me. He'd seen me enough times over 14 days that I was no longer a stranger, a fixture of the concourse, like the diplomatic signage and the climate vents. "Haven't counted bad ones yet today," he said. I looked at him. "None?" I asked. "Not yet," he said, and he smiled briefly with the specific quality of a person who is aware that they are saying something slightly absurd and is saying it anyway because it is also true. "Day's not over." "How many good ones?" He thought for a moment. 41, he said, and counting. Section 21, what Kothmoril wrote. 3 months after the convergence, Ambassador Kothmoril published a 3rd paper in the Interspecies Studies Journal. It was titled, in the formal academic language that the journal requires, Counter-Threat Orientation and Positive Enumeration, a case study in human diplomatic security practice. It was, by the standards of academic papers, widely read. The paper's central argument, stripped of its academic scaffolding, was this: that the human species had developed, in specific high-stress institutional contexts, a practice of deliberate positive counting that functioned as both a neurological self-regulation tool and an unconscious communicative act, and that the communicative function was, in cross-species settings, disproportionately significant because it transmitted a specific emotional behavioral signal. This situation is manageable. This species is steady. This moment does not require panic. That was readable across a wide range of different biological sensory systems. It cited the Sulthrani incident. It cited the Keth officer's chromatophore stabilization. It cited the corridor on day 10 and Volothen's subsequent proposal. It cited in the acknowledgments Specialist Davin Holt, UHADF, Diplomatic Security Unit, for the clearest demonstration of the principle this researcher has encountered in 31 years of field observation. I read the acknowledgment 3 times. Section 22, the last thing Holt said to me. The delegations departed over 2 days following the signing. The human delegation was among the last to leave. Ambassador Verne had bilateral meetings scheduled with 3 delegations on the final day, and the sentry unit maintained its positions until she was aboard the transport. I saw Holt at the threshold point for the last time on the morning of day 16, the day of departure. He was in his post, same posture, same downward gaze, 2 hours before his delegation's transport was scheduled to depart. I stopped. "Last shift," I said. "Last shift," he agreed. I had my archival log running. I had been running it for 16 days. I had over 200,000 words of notes, several hours of video documentation, 47 interviews, and the specific ache behind the sternum that you get when you know something is ending and you're not sure you've captured it right. "Can I ask you something for the record?" I asked. "Sure," he said. "Why did you tell her the truth? When she asked, you could have given her a tactical answer, an official one. Why did you tell her what you were actually doing?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because she was actually asking," he said, "not testing. Not probing for intelligence. She was just curious, and genuine curiosity deserves a genuine answer." I thought about that. "And if she'd used it against you somehow," I asked, "or against the delegation?" He looked at me with those gray-green eyes. Used a guy counting good moments, he said, and the slight upward movement at the corner of his mouth was not quite a smile, but was the precursor to one. That would be a strange weapon to try to deploy. He went back to looking down. I stood there for another minute, not because I had more questions, but because I was trying to hold on to the picture. The intersection, the warm light, the sounds of the station going about its morning, and this one human being at the center of it, still and attending, counting up the things that had not failed. Then I said, 37-1 was the ratio you told Volothen. Over 10 days. What was the final number, all 14 days? He thought about it. 43-1, he said, give or take. I nodded. I want to close this account with something that is not quite academic and not quite personal, but lives in the territory between those two things, which is where the best archival work tends to live. I have been an archivist for 18 months. Before this posting, I thought the work was about capturing what happened, preserving the facts of events so that they remained accurate and accessible. I still think that, but I think it differently now. What I observed over the 14 days of the Verath convergence was a room full of extraordinarily capable beings, diplomats, soldiers, administrators, scholars, all of them under pressure, all of them carrying the weight of their histories and their species' interests and their own fear of failure. And the way they carried those things determined, as much as any specific diplomatic maneuver, what the summit became. The human guard at the corridor intersection was not doing anything grand. He was not making speeches or negotiating treaties or shaping the political architecture of the galaxy. He was standing at a point where one corridor met another and counting small moments that went right.